The afternoon began like many others. School had just ended, and students spilled out onto the sidewalks in loud groups. Some laughed, some argued, and some rushed to buses. Among them was a quiet black girl who walked alone. She carried her bag close to her chest and kept her eyes low, not because she was shy by nature, but because she had learned that being noticed often brought trouble. She had been dealing with small acts of cruelty for months. It started with jokes whispered behind her back, then looks that made her feel small. Teachers rarely noticed, and when they did, it was brushed off as normal behavior. She told herself to stay calm, to focus on getting home, and to believe that things would get better. That day, the air felt heavier than usual. The sky was clear, but something inside her felt uneasy. As she walked, she sensed footsteps behind her. At first, she thought she was imagining it. The street was public, after all. People passed by, cars moved slowly, and shops stayed open. Still, the feeling didn't go away. She reached the corner where she usually turned, but instead of following her normal route, she took a longer path. It was a habit she had picked up, hoping to avoid attention. The area was quieter, with fewer people around. Trees lined the sidewalk, and a small parking lot sat nearby. She thought she would be safe if she kept moving. She was wrong. From behind, voices called out. The tone was mocking, not friendly. Her steps slowed, but she didn't turn around. She knew those voices. They had followed her before, never too far, never close enough for adults to notice. Her heart began to race, and her hands tightened around the straps of her bag. She reminded herself to breathe. She told herself not to show fear. Still, when footsteps moved faster and spread out around her, she realized she was no longer just being followed. She was being surrounded. They stepped in front of her, to the side, and behind. Not touching her yet, but close enough that she felt trapped. Their faces held smirks and careless smiles, the kind that came from thinking they were untouchable. They spoke loudly now, saying things meant to hurt, meant to scare. She looked around for help. The street felt suddenly empty. A few cars passed, but none slowed. A couple of people were far away, too far to hear. She felt invisible, like the world had decided not to see her at that moment. She stood still, trying to think clearly. Running could make things worse. Yelling might not bring help fast enough. Her mind searched for a way out while her heart beat hard against her chest. Across the street, a motorcycle was parked near the edge of the lot. The engine was off, but the bike stood out. Next to it, a man in dark riding gear leaned against the seat. He looked like someone people usually avoided. Broad shoulders, weathered face, and eyes that had seen many things. He had stopped there to take a break, nothing more. At first, he wasn't paying attention. He was checking something in his bag, lost in his own thoughts. Life had taught him to stay alert, but even the most watchful people could miss things when they weren't expecting trouble. Then he heard the voices. Not the words, but the tone. Sharp, mocking, wrong. He looked up and saw the group. He noticed how close they stood, how their bodies blocked the girl's path. He noticed her posture, stiff and tense, like someone trying not to panic. He had seen that look before in many places many years ago. The biker didn't rush in. He watched for a moment, letting his instincts guide him. He had learned the hard way that jumping into situations without reading them could make things worse. Still, something told him this was not just kids joking around. The girl tried to step sideways, but one of them moved with her, cutting her off. That small movement told him everything he needed to know. His jaw tightened. He straightened up and took a few steps closer, staying across the street for now. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply stood where he could see clearly and be seen. His presence alone changed the air. One of the bullies glanced over and noticed him. The smile faded for just a second. The others followed the look and saw him standing there, calm and unafraid. They whispered to each other, clearly unsure. The girl noticed the shift. She followed their gaze and saw the biker. She didn't know who he was or what he would do, but knowing someone else was watching gave her a small sense of relief. She lifted her head slightly, not in confidence, but in hope. The biker crossed his arms and stayed silent. Years on the road had taught him that silence could be louder than words. He made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. The group tried to act casual again, laughing too loudly, saying things meant to hide their fear. But their circle loosened just a little. Enough for the girl to breathe. She didn't move yet. She waited. She had learned that sudden actions could bring sudden reactions. Instead, she focused on staying calm, on not giving them what they wanted. The biker took one more step forward. Not close enough to touch anyone, but close enough to show he was involved now. His eyes stayed on the group, not angry, not soft, just firm. People nearby began to notice. A driver slowed down. Someone exiting a store glanced over. The moment of isolation was fading. The bullies felt it too. The power they thought they had was slipping. They hadn't expected witnesses. They hadn't expected someone who didn't look afraid of them. The girl felt her legs shaking, but she stayed upright. She reminded herself that she was not weak for feeling scared. She was strong for standing there. The biker finally spoke, his voice low and steady. He didn't insult them. He didn't raise his voice. He said just enough to make it clear that what was happening was not okay and that people were watching. Silence followed. The group shifted again, uncertain and exposed. The street no longer belonged to them. The girl took a careful step forward. This time, no one blocked her. She didn't run. She walked slowly at first, then with more purpose. As she passed the biker, their eyes met for a brief moment. He gave a small nod, not as a hero, not as a savior, but as a human being who had chosen not to look away. She kept walking until the sounds of the street returned to normal. Her hand still trembled, but her heart felt lighter than it had moments before. Behind her, the biker stayed where he was, watching until he knew she was safe enough to disappear into the crowd. This was only the beginning. What happened next would change all of them in ways they didn't yet understand. She walked for several blocks before her breathing finally slowed. The street sounds felt louder now, like the world had rushed back in all at once. Cars passed, people talked, and life kept moving. She blended into the crowd near a small bus stop and stood there, pretending she was waiting for someone. Her hands still shook, so she tucked them into her sleeves and stared at the pavement. What had just happened replayed in her mind. The circle, the voices, the way the space around her had closed. She had faced moments like that before, but this time felt different. This time someone had seen it. Someone had stepped in. Across the street, the biker remained near his motorcycle. He didn't follow her. He didn't try to talk to her. He simply stayed where he was, watching the area with quiet focus. He had learned long ago that safety sometimes meant staying nearby without drawing attention. The group that had surrounded her didn't leave right away. They stood off to the side, pretending nothing had happened. Their laughter sounded forced now, thin and unsure. They kept glancing toward the biker, measuring distance and risk. The confidence they had minutes earlier was gone. The biker adjusted his gloves and rested one hand on the seat of his bike. He had seen many versions of this scene over the years. Different places, different faces, the same pattern. People who thought they could act without consequences, as long as no one challenged them. A memory surfaced in his mind, uninvited. A younger version of himself, standing still while something wrong happened nearby. He had told himself it wasn't his business. He had told himself someone else would step in. That choice had stayed with him longer than he liked to admit. He wasn't going to make that mistake again. The girl waited at the bus stop even though no bus was coming soon. She didn't want to move too fast. She didn't want to give the group a reason to follow her again. She kept her face calm, but inside, she felt the aftershocks of fear. She thought about calling someone, but her phone battery was low. She decided to save it in case she needed help later. Instead, she focused on grounding herself, counting breaths, watching passing cars, listening to ordinary sounds. A woman nearby glanced at her and gave a small, kind smile. It wasn't much, but it reminded her she wasn't invisible anymore. Across the street, the biker noticed that too. He saw how the presence of more people changed things, how attention acted like a shield. He stayed put, not leaving until the situation fully dissolved. One of the bullies kicked a pebble across the pavement and muttered something. Another checked their phone and shook their head. Slowly, without saying it out loud, they made a decision. They drifted away in different directions, careful not to look back too many times. The tension eased, but it didn't vanish completely. The girl watched until she was sure they were gone. Only then did she let out a long breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She felt tired, the kind of tired that settles deep in the body. It wasn't just from fear. It was from carrying it for so long. The biker waited a bit longer. When he was satisfied that the area was calm, he walked his bike across the street, stopping a respectful distance away. He didn't approach her directly. He knew how intimidating he could look. Instead, he spoke calmly, keeping his voice low and neutral. He asked if she was okay. She hesitated. Trust didn't come easily to her, especially after what she had just experienced. But something in his tone felt steady, not demanding. She nodded once. Then, after a moment, she nodded again, stronger this time. He told her she didn't have to talk if she didn't want to. He said he would stay nearby until she felt safe leaving. No pressure. No questions. She appreciated that more than he knew. A bus arrived at the stop across the street. People boarded and left. Time moved forward again. The normal rhythm of the city slowly returned. The girl adjusted her bag and finally turned toward the biker. She thanked him quietly. Her voice was soft, but clear. Saying the words felt important. He nodded and said she did the right thing by staying calm and aware. He didn't praise himself. He didn't make the moment bigger than it was. He treated it like what it should have been all along. Basic human decency. She told him she just wanted to get home. He pointed out the safest route, one with more foot traffic and open stores. He said he'd ride behind her for a few blocks, just far enough not to draw attention. She agreed, grateful for the offer. They moved at an easy pace. She walked. He rolled beside the curb, engine quiet. He kept his eyes on the street, scanning corners and reflections. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other. As they went, she felt something slowly shift inside her. The fear was still there, but it was no longer in control. In its place was a small sense of strength. Not because someone had rescued her, but because she had endured and kept going. The biker noticed her shoulders relax little by little. He had seen that change before too. It reminded him why moments like this mattered. After a few blocks, she stopped near a busy intersection and turned to him. She said she'd be okay from there. He believed her. He wished her well and reminded her that what happened wasn't her fault. That the problem belonged to the people who chose to harm, not the person who endured it. She nodded, holding those words carefully, like something fragile but valuable. He watched as she crossed the street and disappeared into the crowd. Only when she was fully out of sight did he start his bike. As the engine came to life, he felt a familiar mix of relief and resolve. Relief that the moment had passed without further harm. Resolve to keep paying attention, to keep choosing not to look away. The girl reached home later than usual. She set her bag down and sat quietly for a while, letting the day settle. She didn't tell anyone right away. She wasn't sure how to put it into words yet. But she knew one thing for certain. Someone had seen her. And because of that, tomorrow didn't feel quite as heavy as it had before. The next morning felt strange to her. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt normal. She woke up before her alarm and lay still, staring at the ceiling. The memory of the day before came back in pieces. The street, the circle, the quiet moment when someone chose to step in. She moved slowly as she got ready for school. Each small task helped her steady her thoughts. She ate a little, packed her bag, and checked her phone. No new messages. Life had not paused even though she had. On the walk to school, she chose the busiest streets. She stayed near other people and kept her head up. Fear tried to follow her, but she didn't let it lead. She reminded herself that she made it home. She reminded herself that she wasn't alone, even when it felt that way. At school, the halls were loud and crowded. Lockers slammed. Friends talked over one another. Teachers called out reminders. She moved through it all like someone watching from the outside. She noticed the group from the day before across the hallway. They noticed her too. This time they didn't smile. They looked away quickly, pretending to be busy. Their energy was different, less bold, less certain. She didn't know why yet, but she felt the change. In class, she struggled to focus. Her mind drifted to questions she couldn't answer. Had anyone reported what happened? Would it happen again? Would she always have to be on guard? At lunch, she sat at the edge of a long table. She wasn't hiding, but she wasn't drawing attention either. A few students nearby talked about something that happened after school the day before. They mentioned police cars near the street. They mentioned adults asking questions. Her chest tightened. She listened quietly. Apparently, someone had called it in. A witness. A bystander who refused to ignore what they saw. The bullies had been spoken to. Their parents had been contacted. Nothing dramatic, but enough to make it clear that their actions were seen. She felt a mix of relief and nervousness. Relief that the truth had surfaced. Nervousness about what that might mean next. Across town, the biker sat at a small diner, sipping coffee. He didn't usually stay in one place long, but that morning he felt the need to slow down. The events of the day before stayed with him, not as a burden but as a reminder. He thought about the girl's face when the situation changed. The way fear shifted into something steadier. He had seen that look before and it always stayed with him. He wasn't someone who talked much about his past. Most people only saw the jacket, the bike, and the rough edges. They didn't see the years of lessons learned the hard way. They didn't see the mistakes that shaped his choices. He believed that strength wasn't about size or noise. It was about paying attention, about stepping in when it mattered. After finishing his coffee, he rode past the same area as the day before. Not out of habit, but out of care. He didn't expect to see anything, and he didn't. The street looked normal again. That was a good thing. Back at school, the girl met with a counselor later that day. It wasn't easy to talk. Her voice shook at first. But the counselor listened without interrupting, without blaming, without rushing. She shared what had been happening for months. The small moments people often ignored. The jokes, the looks, the way fear had slowly become part of her routine. The counselor took it seriously. Notes were written. Plans were discussed. She wasn't promised instant fixes, but she was promised support. That mattered. Word spread quietly through the school. Not gossip, but awareness. Teachers paid closer attention. Staff kept an eye on the usual trouble spots. The group that had surrounded her felt that shift. They tried to act like nothing had changed, but it had. Their space was smaller now, their freedom less certain. The girl noticed it too. She walked the halls with a little more confidence. Not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because she knew eyes were open now. That afternoon, she left school with a friend she trusted. They talked about normal things. Music, homework, weekend plans. Felt good to be ordinary again, even for a moment. As they passed the street where it happened, her steps slowed. The place looked harmless in daylight. Trees swayed gently. Cars moved calmly. It was strange how a place could hold so much memory and still look so simple. She stopped for a second and took a deep breath. Then she kept walking. Across the city, the biker got a call from someone he trusted. The caller mentioned the situation, told him that things were being handled, that the girl was safe, that what he did mattered. He listened quietly and said little. Praise made him uncomfortable. He didn't see his actions as special. To him, they were necessary. That evening, the girl sat at home and wrote in a notebook she rarely used. She didn't write about fear. She wrote about strength, about how it felt to be seen, about how one moment could shift the direction of a day, or even a life. She realized she didn't want to stay silent anymore. Not out of anger, but out of honesty. She wanted others to know they weren't alone either. The next few days passed without incident. Each calm day felt like a small victory. The group kept their distance. Adults stayed alert. The air felt lighter. The biker continued his routines, but something had changed for him too. He paid even closer attention to the world around him. He reminded himself that courage didn't always roar. Sometimes it stood quietly and refused to move. One afternoon, as the girl walked home again, she noticed the same motorcycle parked a block away. Not close, not obvious, just there. She didn't wave. He didn't either. They both understood. Life moved forward, shaped by a moment that could have gone very differently. A moment that proved how much impact one person could have by simply choosing to care. And though the story was far from over, both of them knew something important had already changed. Silence no longer felt like the only option. Days passed and a new routine slowly formed. The girl woke up each morning with a mix of caution and calm. She still felt alert, but the sharp edge of fear had softened. School no longer felt like a place she had to survive minute by minute. It was still challenging, but it was manageable. She noticed small changes first. A teacher paused longer when voices rose in the hallway. A staff member stood near the doors during dismissal. Simple things, but they made a difference. She realized that when people paid attention, behavior changed. The group that once surrounded her kept their distance. They didn't confront her. They didn't whisper loudly anymore. When their paths crossed, they looked past her as if she weren't there. She preferred that to being targeted. Silence this time felt safer. Still, the experience stayed with her. Some nights, she lay awake thinking about how close things had come to going wrong. She thought about how easily people could be hurt when no one stepped in. Those thoughts didn't weaken her. They made her more aware. One afternoon, a school assembly was announced. It focused on respect, accountability, and speaking up. Normally, she would have expected the words to slide past without meaning much. This time they landed differently. She listened carefully, feeling like the message was meant for her and for everyone else in the room. When the speaker talked about bystanders, her chest tightened. She remembered the moment across the street when one person chose not to look away. She understood now how powerful that choice had been. After the assembly, students returned to class quietly. Conversations were softer. Even those who usually joked about everything seemed thoughtful for once. It didn't erase the past, but it shifted the mood. Later that day, the counselor checked in with her. They talked about boundaries and confidence, about trusting instincts, about asking for help without feeling weak. The counselor reminded her that strength could be quiet and steady. She carried those words with her as she walked home. The biker continued his days on the road, but the city felt different to him now. He noticed small details he might have ignored before. A child standing alone at a corner. A raised voice outside a store. He didn't jump into every situation, but he stayed alert. He believed the world didn't need more heroes. It needed more people willing to notice. One evening, he stopped at a community center to drop off supplies for an event. He didn't stay long, but he listened as people talked about safety and looking out for one another. He didn't speak much, but he nodded along, understanding the importance of shared responsibility. The girl spent more time writing in her notebook. It became a place where she could sort her thoughts without judgment. She wrote about fear but also about growth, about how one moment didn't define her, but it did teach her. She also began to speak up in small ways. When someone made an unkind comment in class, she didn't laugh it off anymore. She stayed quiet, but her expression made it clear she didn't agree. That alone changed the tone. Her confidence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. One afternoon, as she left school, she noticed the street was busier than usual. Parents waited near cars. A shop owner stood outside sweeping. The environment felt watched in a good way. She walked with steady steps, her shoulders relaxed. When she reached the corner where everything had happened, she paused again. Not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to acknowledge the moment. She stood there for a few seconds, then turned and continued on. From a distance, the biker saw her. He recognized her walk, her calm pace. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. Seeing her safe was enough. Later that week, the school sent out a notice to families about increased focus on student safety. It didn't mention names or details, but it sent a clear message. The community responded with support. The group that once caused trouble felt the pressure. Adults watched more closely. Consequences felt real now. They weren't the center of attention anymore, and that unsettled them. The girl noticed that too. Power shifted when accountability entered the room. She started walking home with her head held higher. Not out of pride, but out of self-respect. She understood that what happened to her didn't mean she was weak. It meant she had survived something difficult. The biker reflected on his own journey. He thought about the people who had stepped in for him when he was younger. The ones who had offered guidance instead of judgment. He realized he was becoming that person for someone else, even without words. One afternoon, rain began to fall suddenly. The girl took shelter under an awning, laughing softly at the surprise. Life felt normal again in that moment. Light, unburdened. The biker watched the rain too, parked nearby. He smiled to himself, just a little. The days continued, each one building on the last. The fear that once followed her like a shadow faded into a memory. Not forgotten but no longer controlling her. She understood now that silence could be broken. That people could change the outcome of a moment by choosing awareness. And while the story was still unfolding, one truth was clear. She was no longer alone in it. As weeks passed, the memory of that afternoon no longer felt sharp, but it never fully disappeared. It lived quietly in the background of her thoughts, reminding her how quickly things could change. Instead of frightening her, it pushed her to stay aware of herself and the world around her. She noticed how her reactions had shifted. Before, she would freeze when tension appeared. Now she paused, assessed, and chose her next step. That change didn't happen overnight, and it didn't come from anger. It came from learning that she had a voice, even when she used it softly. At school, she became more engaged. She raised her hand once or twice in class, surprising herself more than anyone else. Each time she spoke, her confidence grew just a little. Teachers responded with encouragement, and that made her feel seen in a new way. She also noticed others watching her differently, not with judgment, but with curiosity and respect. Some students who had never spoken to her before now nodded when passing. A few offered simple greetings, small gestures but meaningful. The group that once caused her fear stayed away. They moved through the halls quietly, careful not to draw attention. Their power had faded, replaced by accountability and watchful eyes. They weren't gone, but they no longer controlled the space. One afternoon, the counselor invited her to join a small discussion group focused on peer support. At first, she hesitated. Speaking openly still felt risky, but she remembered how it felt to be alone, and she decided to try. In that room, she heard stories that sounded familiar. Different details, same feelings. Fear, isolation, hope. Listening to others made her realize how common silence had been among them. How many moments could have been changed if someone had spoken sooner. When it was her turn, she shared just enough. She didn't describe everything. She didn't need to. Her words were simple and honest. The room stayed quiet, not out of discomfort, but out of respect. Afterward, she felt lighter, like she had set something down that she had been carrying for too long. The biker continued his routines, but he found himself thinking more about community than ever before. He attended a few local meetings, standing quietly at the back. He didn't wear his jacket there. He wanted people to see a person first, not a symbol. He listened as parents talked about safety and trust, as neighbors shared concerns. He realized that real change came from many small actions, not one big moment. Sometimes he rode past the school area at the end of the day. Not every time, not obviously, just enough to stay aware. He never interfered unless necessary. Most days everything stayed calm. One afternoon, he saw the girl walking with steady confidence. She laughed at something her friend said, the sound clear and free. He didn't stop. He didn't need to. That moment told him everything. At home, she spent evenings helping with chores and listening to music. Life felt fuller again. She still had worries, but they no longer defined her days. She began to think about the future in a new way. Not just about getting through the next week, but about what kind of person she wanted to be. She knew she wanted to stand up for others, even if it meant feeling uncomfortable at times. One day, She saw another student sitting alone near the same street where everything had happened. The student looked nervous, scanning the area. Her heart beat faster as she watched. She remembered how that felt. She didn't rush over. She didn't make a scene. She simply walked closer and stood nearby, pretending to check her phone. Her presence changed the space. The student noticed and relaxed slightly. A few minutes later, they walked away safely. She stood there for a moment after, realizing what she had done. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heroic. But it mattered. That evening, she wrote about it in her notebook. About how courage could be passed from one person to another quietly. The biker, on his ride home, passed the same street and saw nothing out of the ordinary. That was the goal. Normalcy meant safety. He thought about how cycles could be broken, how awareness could spread without force. As the days went on, the girl felt stronger in her own skin. She still remembered the fear, but it no longer ruled her choices. She had learned that moments didn't have to repeat themselves. She understood now that being seen wasn't about attention. It was about dignity, and dignity, once reclaimed, had a way of growing. Both of them continued forward, changed in ways that were quiet but lasting. Neither sought recognition. Neither expected thanks. They were connected by a moment that proved how much difference one decision could make. And as life moved on, that lesson stayed with them, shaping every step that followed. Time moved forward, steady and quiet. What once felt like a heavy memory slowly became a lesson instead. The girl noticed that she no longer replayed that day in her mind as often. When she did, it no longer came with fear, came with clarity. She understood now that what happened did not define her. How she responded afterward did. Her days became fuller. She focused more on her studies and found herself enjoying small things again. Morning sunlight through the window, music playing softly while she did homework, short conversations that made her smile. Life had returned to its normal rhythm, but she moved through it with more awareness. At school, she continued attending the peer support group. She didn't speak every time, but when she did, her words mattered. Others listened. Some nodded, some smiled. A few later thanked her quietly for saying what they couldn't. She learned that strength didn't always show itself in bold actions. Sometimes it lived in patience, honesty, and choosing not to give up. The environment around her continued to change. Teachers remained watchful. Staff stayed present during key moments of the day. Students understood that behavior had consequences. The halls felt calmer, safer. The group that once surrounded her faded further into the background. They no longer held attention or influence. Accountability had taken that away. Over time, they became just another part of the crowd no longer feared. One afternoon, the girl was asked to help with a school project about kindness and awareness. She almost said no. Speaking in front of others still made her nervous. But she remembered how silence had once made things worse. She agreed. She didn't tell her whole story. She didn't need to. She spoke about paying attention, about standing nearby when something felt wrong, about how presence could change a situation. Her voice was calm, steady, and honest. The room stayed quiet, not out of discomfort but respect. Afterward, several students approached her. Some shared small stories of their own. Others simply thanked her. She felt proud, not because of attention, but because she had chosen courage. The biker continued his life much the same way, riding through familiar streets and unfamiliar towns. But something stayed with him. He noticed how often people looked away from uncomfortable moments. He also noticed how much power there was in staying. One evening, he parked near the same street where everything had begun. The place looked ordinary now, peaceful. He stood there for a moment, letting the memory settle. He didn't regret stopping that day. Not for a second. He believed that moments like that were tests. Quiet ones. Tests of character. The girl walked that same street later, alone but unafraid. She moved at her own pace, head held naturally high. She wasn't proving anything. She was simply living. As she passed the spot, she paused briefly, then continued on. She no longer needed to look back. At home that evening, she opened her notebook for the last time on that subject. She wrote about growth, about choosing not to let fear decide her future, about how one person paying attention had changed everything. She closed the notebook gently and set it aside. Weeks turned into months. The memory softened further. Life brought new challenges, new moments, new lessons. She met them with quiet confidence. She became someone others felt safe around. Someone who noticed. Someone who stayed. The biker rode past the school one final time before leaving the area for good. He didn't stop. He didn't need to. Knowing things were better was enough. Their paths did not cross again, and that was okay. Some connections were meant to be brief but meaningful. The story did not end with applause or headlines. It ended with something better. Change. Awareness. Strength that lasted. It showed that real courage did not need an audience. It only needed a moment and a choice. And because of that choice, a young girl learned she was never powerless. She had always been stronger than she knew.